So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Memo Akten. Memo is a multidisciplinary artist, experimental filmmaker, musician, and computer scientist from Turkey. He has been working with emerging technologies for many years now, drawing from fields such as artificial intelligence, computational creativity, neuroscience, physics, biology, ecology, and philosophy. He has a PhD in artificial intelligence from Goldsmiths in London and expressive PhD, in expressive human-machine interaction. And with his work, he's considered one of the world's leading pioneers in the use of AI in art. He's currently assistant professor of computational new media art at University of California, San Diego. And among his many accolades, Memo received the Golden Nika at Ars Electronica in 2013, and he has exhibited and performed internationally at venues such as the Grand Palais, the Barbican, the Royal Opera House, ZKM, Sonar Festival, Moscow Museum of Modern Art, Shanghai Ming Contemporary Art Museum, and many, many others. He has served as mentor and jury on numerous international awards, residencies, and conferences such as SIGGRAPH, Ars Electronica, and Google Arts and Culture. Memo, very nice to see you. We are ready for your keynote presentation. The floor for about the next 40 minutes is yours.
Thank you very much, Theo. Hopefully you can hear me and you can all see my screen. I'm very honored to be giving the opening keynote to the first of this conference, this symposium, particularly at a time, at a very critical time, I think, and I'll get to that. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the world, wherever you might be. For me, it's 9 a.m. I'm in Turkey. And the title of my talk is Distributed Consciousness. And this title comes from a project that I did last year that also has the same title, Distributed Consciousness. And when Theo first invited me to give this keynote, I thought I would talk about that project and the motivations and the themes behind that project. But a lot has happened in the last few months. When I made that project last year, we didn't have Disco Diffusion, we didn't have DALL-E 2, we didn't have Midjourney, we didn't have Stable Diffusion, which came out just a few days ago. And the impact of these things, I think, are more significant than we realize. And if you're not familiar with what these things are, that is exactly what I'm going to talk about. And it turns out that this title, Distributed Consciousness, I think is even more relevant now than it was last year when I was making the work that I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to talk too much about my past work. I want to talk about some of these new themes, but first, to give a bit of context, I do want to talk a little bit about where I come from to give a very, very quick but broad overview. So this is a selection of my work for the last kind of 15 years. I'm a computational artist. Theo already kind of gave a very in-depth summary of where I've kind of come from and what I've done. So I'll just very briefly talk about some of my motivations over the 2 decades. I'm very interested in nature and the nature of nature. But when I talk about nature, I don't just mean flowers. I also mean the phenomena that drives everything around us, from the nuclear fusion in the heart of the sun to the photosynthesizing organisms that fuel all of life on Earth, as well as the incredibly complex hyperobjects that we call human civilization and culture, and all the technologies that we create as well. And so my craft, so to speak, is code. I program. So everything that you're seeing here is essentially the result of custom software that I write to produce the kind of things that I want it to produce. And one of the aspects that I'm really, really interested in is, as Theo mentioned, expressive human-machine interaction. How do we, as humans, communicate with machines in an effective way, such that we can get machines to do what we want them to do? And as an artist, I'm particularly interested in doing this kind of interaction for expressive, creative works, and basically to augment human creative expression. This is what I've been doing for the past 2 decades, and I started a PhD in 2014 at Goldsmiths, which is where I met Theo, actually. And my PhD was in deep learning. So deep learning is the flavor of AI that we have today. So in 2014, I started doing a PhD, and I finished it in kind of 2018, but because of the pandemic, it took a bit longer in the end. But my PhD was in meaningful human control. How can we as humans meaningfully control the output of, let's say, generative deep learning models? And what has happened within the last year, I think, is nothing short of quite mind-blowing. And that's what the topic of my talk today is going to be. So you might have seen this video briefly in the kind of clip that I played. This is from 2015. This is using an algorithm called Deep Dream. Some of you might be quite familiar with this. Arguably, this is when the deep learning revolution, or the AI revolution for the arts, began. I don't want to say AI because AI goes back, way back to the 60s with Harold Cohen, etc. But particularly machine learning, or particularly deep learning in the arts, began with, I'd say, with Deep Dream in 2015. In 2015, we also had style transfer. We also had the first DC image-based DC GAN. So it was a big year for the arts clashing with deep learning. But I was really obsessed with Deep Dream. The reason I was really obsessed with Deep Dream was because, and I won't go into the technical details of it now, because I was really interested in how our minds became entangled with the algorithm. Because we would look at this and we would say, oh, look at all the puppy slugs, look at all the bird lizards. But actually, there are no puppy slugs or bird lizards. What's happening is the Deep Dream algorithm is seeing noise, and it's trying to make sense of that noise based on what it already knows. And it amplifies certain neural activations to modify the image such that it can recognize it. So it projects recognizable features onto that noise. And then when we look at the resulting image, that's exactly what we do. Obviously, the mechanisms through which our brain does it is completely different. But conceptually, we look at this and we're trying to make sense of this noise. We're projecting these puppies and slugs onto this image. So in a sense, our minds are completely entangled with this system. The biological and the artificial neural network are entangled in this duet of meaning making. So a lot of my work, particularly back then in those days, using deep learning, was around this. It was about exploring how machines that learn reflect on the world and how we can use that to reflect on our own self-affirming cognitive biases. Because you can put this into an artificial neural network. It's pure random white noise. And it goes on a long journey through multiple dimensions and transformations in space and time, because quite literally, that is what a deep neural network is, to produce this, a more structured noise with a particular distribution. And we are machines that yearn structure. It's who we are and what we've always done. We look for patterns and we find them and we project what we know onto them. We invent stories and we believe them. This is how we deal with uncertainty, and it's how we connect with each other. We invent rituals, algorithms for the body and mind to transform our mental and emotional states to otherwise unattainable modes of being. We see things not as they are, but as we are. Everything that you see or read or hear, even these sentences that I'm saying right now, you're trying to make sense of by relating to your own past experiences, filtered by your prior beliefs and knowledge. And actually, I have no idea what any of what I'm saying means to any of you. It's impossible for me to see the world through your eyes and feel what you feel without having read everything you've read, seen everything you've seen, and lived everything you've lived. So this is from a series of projects called Learning to See. It's an artificial neural network running real-time inference on a live camera input. And there's a few themes behind this work. On a practical level, it's part of my research on meaningful human control. So particularly around the time when I did this, we could get machines to generate images, but we had no control over what that image was. So part of my research was, how can I control and perform, particularly in real time, what the machine creates? How can I tell it to create fire instead of clouds? How can I tell it to create fire here or there? So this was one attempt at doing it. But there are higher level motivations here. So this is a network which has seen nothing but thousands of images of waves or flowers. And it looks upon the world and sees my desk and my hands and these cables. And it tries to make sense of it in context of what it's seen before. But it can see only through the filter of what it already knows, just like us, because we too see things not as they are, but as we are. So as well as a number of videos, I also made this as an installation. There's a plinth with a bunch of junk on it, broken cables, some dirty rags. And you can spend a few seconds playing with them for a quick bit of fun. Or if you're like me, you can spend hours meticulously crafting your perfect bouquet. And for example, I didn't code that the earbuds and this cloth should form flowers in a particular way. But because the system is real-time and interactive with continuous control, I could play and learn it the same way one learns to play a musical instrument. And I discovered that this is what the system had done. So this is part of how I was thinking that we would work together, humans and machines, to try and communicate with machines. But something really huge happened in 2021, which I'm going to get to, which kind of changed my opinion on that. So meanwhile, back to this project, I trained a model on waves. Flowers represents earth. So these are the four elements of nature. There was fire as clouds, and then the fifth element, cosmos. Beyond our planets, the ether, the void, cosmos. This is a neural network trained on thousands of images from the Hubble Space Telescope. So I realized I forgot to enable sound. I'm just going to need to stop screen sharing for 1 second and reshare, because I need to enable sound. Okay. Hopefully you can hear this.
I like to think of a cybernetic network where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where ideas draw peacefully past computers, as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, return to our mammal brothers and sisters. And all watched over by machines of love and grace.
So this was a poem by, let me just mute it. So this was a poem by Richard Brautigan from 1967 that I read, and I made the visuals. I made this exactly a year ago, in July 2021. And it kind of blew my mind that I could do this in 2021, and the Deep Dream video was 2015. And in the 6 years, we had gone from that Deep Dream video to this. And this is made possible, this particular video, with a technology called Transformers, which came out in 2017, but in particular in January of last year. So the timelines are quite important here. In January of last year, 2021, a company by the name of OpenAI released something called Clip, which is what underlies what I'm using here, which is basically allows you to use text to generate images. I mean, Clip is a bit more generic, but basically a couple of Twitter users, Advernoun and Crows Have Wings, made some codes that allowed you to generate images using Clip. So at the time, it was pretty raw code. The animation aspects I had to add in, and it's pretty tedious work, but basically everything you're seeing here is made with just text descriptions. And that was already blowing my mind like crazy. Now we're just 1 year later, and I'll show you some new images of what's happened in this past year. But before I do that, I want to talk about the actual project Distributed Consciousness, which I also made last year. I was working on this in July, August. And this also uses the same technology. So all the images that you see were generated with text, just basically prompts. But I'll talk about this project and the motivations. So this Distributed Consciousness began life as an NFT collection, and it evolved into other things, installations. And in fact, the work that I have as part of the exhibition is a kind of virtual installation version of this. The team's done an amazing job getting that online. So please do check the exhibition. So Distributed Consciousness is a multifaceted work that spans themes of artificial intelligence, distributed computation, distributed cognition, evolution, phenomenology, ecological awareness, climate change, activism, and cephalopods. It uses the technologies of machine learning, generated imagery and text, steganography, and blockchain-based smart contracts and NFTs. So as I mentioned, the project first manifested itself as an NFT collection. These are some of the images from the NFT collection. So these are all AI-generated images. I use custom software. This is a bit more than just prompts, but actually that's kind of detail that's not relevant right now. And so there's 256 images I made. That's 2 to the power of 8, because obviously octopuses have 8 legs. And actually, there's 2 separate NFT collections that are related, and everything that I showed so far was from the first one. I call these tentacular critters, and I released the project in 2 phases, which I think of as a kind of 2-part performance. The first phase was the release of the 256 images of the tentacular critters, and that took place from the 16th to the 31st of October last year. And I released 16 every day using like an automated smart contract. Every day, 16 was spawned into the world and put up for auction. And I didn't do anything to create a community. I didn't even have a Discord, which is what all NFT projects need. But somehow a community formed and evolved. So that was quite fascinating to observe. But I'll move on. A month after the release, I announced the second phase. And the second phase was that there was a secret. And the secret was that every one of the 256 images that was spawned and minted and sold had in fact some text cryptographically encoded in it using steganography. This was a verse hidden amongst the pixels, invisible to the human eye, but readable by code. And so the entire collection of images is in fact a poem, a book, a manifesto. And this entire text was also generated using AI, using another transformer called GPT-3, which you might have heard of. So this manifesto is a human-machine co-creation meditation and spans topics of consciousness, free will, life, death, art, technology, ritual, ecology, economy, and sustainability. And already working with these things last year and the years before, I was very aware of their literal consciousness expanding capabilities, particularly working with GPT-3, because, I mean, many people will say that it's not perfect. You can tell that it's not human. But that's really not, I think, the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that it's trained on the entirety of the internet. And talking with GPT-3 is kind of like talking with a search engine, except it's not a search engine, it's a search and synthesis engine. It's not giving you what's happened, it's giving you what could happen. So in a way, I would have a conversation and I could get it to format what I was saying and embellish it and literally give me answers based on what the entirety of the collective consciousness of humanity that has been archived on the internet has said about a particular topic. So as part of this secret reveal, each verse I released over the course of the following weeks as audiovisual readings. You can see the entire manifesto at this URL. It's about an hour and a half long, the whole thing. And I've edited that down to 25 minutes for an installation version, and that's the version that's also in the exhibition. And just to give you an idea, I'll just play a very short excerpt.
Your consciousness is not confined to your body, but extends infinitely in all directions. You are not a separate being from the rest of the universe, but an integral part of it. There is no such thing as a separate body. You are merely an accumulation of energy fields, flowing particles and vibrating strings. Whenever you see the hundreds and hundreds of stars in the sky, remember, whenever the internet is not a bunch of computers connected to each other, but a bunch of human minds connected to each other. It is an incredible technology, but technology is not neutral. Right now, the biggest tech companies are making some of the most important connections in our society, connecting people with products and services, connecting advertisers to users.
So yeah, it's like that for 25 minutes. And I do, urge you to check it out. It's quite fascinating for me working with particularly GPT-3 in that context, because I do feel, I've never said this before, and I'm working with AI a lot, or all kinds of algorithmic technologies, but this is the first one where I will say that this was a collaboration with the computer. This was a collaboration with the computer. Maybe if that's stretching it, it was a collaboration with the collective consciousness of everyone who has contributed to the model that I interacted with. And that's a bold claim. I'm going to come back to it at the end. So I want to first talk about some of the motivations behind this particular project before coming back to what's happening right now. So there's a few threads behind this work. The first one is what I call the spark. So I've been, throughout the pandemic, and even right now, actually, I've been in a small fishing village in the Mediterranean in Turkey. And I go snorkeling pretty much daily, and I see octopuses very often. And usually they're like 3-4 meters deep, where you don't see much color. The water filters out all the frequencies, so that's why you always just see bluish green. But one day I saw an octopus on a rock, just a few centimeters from the surface, where it was under a full spectrum of sunlight, and it flashed at me the most intense colors, and it completely blew my mind. And this was the spark that ignited all the loose, highly flammable material that was floating around in my head at the time. And it's worth parking that particular aspect with regards to how ideas happen and how inspiration and sparks go together, because I'll be revisiting this phenomena at the very end of my presentation. And in fact, I tweeted this at the time. The second thread relates to the blockchain, and there's a lot to be said about the current developments around so-called Web3 phenomena, whether it's the VC-backed hyper-capitalist extreme libertarian values driving its growth, or the ecological nightmare that is proof-of-work blockchain, such as Ethereum. But the point I'd like to focus on right now is the more philosophical one. I've been working within this field of AI for many years, but only recently has this term exploded in popularity. This is the Google News trends if you search for AI. And as you can see, it exploded around 2015. And this is the term, this is the graph for the term big data. You can see that it didn't exist till about 2011, and then it started exploding. So I'm really fascinated by how after a steady period of big data, we get AI. I like the provocation that consciousness is evolution's solution to dealing with big data in the natural world. And I wrote a big article about this, well, a blog post in 2014, talking about how as big data evolved in the natural world with vision, etc., our neural pathways had to be more efficient in dealing with that, to be able to make predictions about the world, to escape predators or hunt down prey, and even more complex organisms to be able to model the environment would have to make become more intelligent. And going even further, to make any kind of social interactions, we might need to have a kind of a model of not just the environment, but of other entities, of agents in this environment, as well as a model of ourselves as an agent in that environment, modeling other agents, modeling themselves and modeling us as well. So your consciousness is in fact an abstracted high-level interface that I can empathize with. It's my interface to you. So I like this metaphor and provocation of consciousness being evolution, sort of dealing with big data in the natural world. And now I'm really interested on the rise of decentralized computation or distributed computation with smart contract-based blockchains. I find this fascinating as a metaphor relating to the rise of multicellular organisms in biology, where every cell in the body is itself an autonomous machine, also containing a full copy of the genetic code, and a body is a distributed network of such cells reaching consensus in a distributed manner. And the third thread is just related to what remarkable creatures cephalopods are, and their level of intelligence and their type of intelligence is so alien to us. They don't even have, well, their central brain is just 10% of their central nervous system. Each arm is pretty much semi-autonomous, and the arms can communicate with each other without even informing the central brain. So the octopus has a very alien distributed intelligence. It's a very different kind of intelligence to the one that we're accustomed to. And to paraphrase the philosopher Thomas Nagel, can we even imagine what it is like to be an octopus? And the fourth thread behind this project is related to the rise of AI and how it's forced us to think about these other kinds of intelligences. As I mentioned, 2015 is when the AI explosion happened in our kind of mainstream collective consciousness. So that was 2015. And in 2016, we had not one, not two, but 3 mainstream books on octopuses. And these are all really wonderful books. So they are Simon Montgomery's Solo on Octopus, Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway, and Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. And they came out in that order in 2016. They're all really wonderful books in very different ways, but of course, none of these books are really just about cephalopods. Instead, all of these books invite us to reflect on the nature of our relationship with non-human intelligences and consciousnesses that we share our planet with. They invite us to face the final Copernican trauma that is waiting ahead of us, to relinquish that last bastion of hope that we are desperately clinging onto with regards to somehow being a superior and uniquely special species. So with the emergence of AI, we are now facing these age-old questions that we've pondered over for thousands of years through this new lens of computation. And cephalopods, with their incredibly advanced and distributed intelligence, represent a great example of an already existing, non-human, seemingly alien, decentralized mind. To quote Cy Montgomery from The Soul of an Octopus, more than 500 million years ago, the lineage that would lead to octopuses and the one leading to humans separated. Was it possible, I wondered, to reach another mind on the other side of that divide? Octopuses represent the great mystery of the other. Peter Godfrey Smith has a very similar sentiment. In the interests of time, I'm not going to read it. Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble, she takes a very different approach. Again, in the interest of time, I won't read the quote, but I'd say her sentiment is quite similar, but she expands into thinking about other ways of being in the world, and thinking beyond just our bodies and minds, and as individuals that are independent from nature, quote unquote. And so distributed consciousness was the project that I tried to bring all of these things together and invite us to meditate on the interconnectedness of all human, non-human, living and non-living things across manifold scales of time and space, and meditate on the awe-inspiring beauty of the universe with all its complexity and simplicity that gave rise to the different kinds of minds able to meditate back on the awe-inspiring beauty of the universe, particularly in times of ecological collapse and urgency, and encourage thinking about working towards multi-species flourishing and abandoning blind faith in gods, both the old overseers and the new technofixers. To quote Neil deGrasse Tyson, we are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically. So that was what the original distributed consciousness was about. I went through it quite quickly because I want to talk about distributed consciousness version 2. This was all my motivations last year. As I mentioned, I used transformers and OpenAI's Clip. And at the time, it was quite inaccessible, what I did and the way I did that project. But it was on its route to becoming relatively accessible. There was a huge open source movement, pretty much organizing on Twitter and Discord to produce so-called Google Colab notebooks, which would allow people to use these tools without coding, without necessarily having a technical background. And so towards, I guess, the second half of last year, all of a sudden we started getting things like Disco Diffusion, which is a Google Colab notebook that allows non-technical folks to play with these technologies. And then over the months, something called Midjourney was released and DALL-E 2 was released. And I'll start with DALL-E. It basically looks like this. You type in a sentence and you get an image. This is in a beta, so it's not accessible by everybody, but it's the first one that really gave quite even more incredible results. I was blown away by what I could achieve last year. But when I first started playing with DALL-E, it really blew my mind. So I'm going to go through a few thousands of images. And I wanted to focus on the quantity here because I'm less interested personally in the quality of individual images, but rather just the magnitude of the space of possibilities, the universe. So here I'm always trying to create, I'm not fully exploring, I'm still working in the distributed consciousness universe of structures. So Donna Haraway talks about the tentacular critters with the feelers and the hair and the unduly things. So that was really the aesthetic that I was going for. And basically, you know, I could generate thousands of these images within a matter of hours. One of the methods that we use is something called variations, where you'd say, okay, I like that one, give me more of that kind of image. And this allows you to, instead of just getting random images, kind of go down rabbit holes and explore and, in a way, meaningfully control the outputs. So I'm just going to go through really, really quickly here, just to give you an idea of the scale of what the machine is generating. I give it one prompt, and I tweak the prompt. So I might say a glass structures, this, that, the other, and yeah, it just goes through. So it's worth noting, I would point out that these images, the images themselves aren't necessarily what we might think of as artistic or pretty images. One could argue that the content, like maybe these structures, are like sculptures, that they might be considered artworks. But these images, they just look like they're randomly cropped. They're not necessarily pretty images. Really, the goal here, I see this as a tool to expand my imagination, to come up with concepts, visual or even structural, and eventually use these for, you know, games, films, books, or just ideation. You know, it just goes on and on. I tried creating more quote unquote pretty images if you prompted it accordingly, you know, a beautiful artistic photograph of an intricate glass sculpture, etc. But I'm quite amazed by how well DALL-E understands light and reflection and refraction and translucency, even subsurface scattering. And while the way the light responds might not be mathematically or physically perfectly accurate, to a first approximation, it's definitely, I find it very convincing and quite photorealistic. So I tried other approaches. These are some sketches. I told it to generate sketches or technical illustrations. I'm quite impressed by the consistency within each image, like how it draws the same structure that it invents from different perspectives. So it kind of shows that it has an internal model of what it is creating, some kind of annotated diagrams. And while these images are not functional technical illustrations, you couldn't use them for manufacture, I'd like to emphasize the first key point that I want to drive home today, and that is, as impressive as all this is, which I think it is very impressive, it's still raw research. The tools themselves are so rudimentary. There hasn't been any effort on producing tools that we humans would want if we wanted to use them for creative purposes. Now that we are seeing the technology, the raw technology capable of producing incredible images, now we will enter a new phase where we will see lots of startups, lots of funding into making tools that sit on top of this technology that allow us to use it in a way that we want to use it. So if you thought that what happened in this last year was crazy, which I think it was, I think the next few years is going to be even crazier. Here's a few more images. I was kind of going for a Wes Anderson style look from a film set, and you know, I'm pretty happy with these results. Again, the key thing to think about here is this is a tool that's not just augmenting my creativity, but it's expanding my imagination. And I'm going to come back to that. So now I'll switch to Midjourney. Midjourney is a completely different tool. It's a tiny company founded by David Holtz, who was the founder of Leap Motion, if you know what that is. It's not, they have no external funding. It's a kind of like an experiment. And the creator and founder of David Holtz has said many times in interviews, he didn't want to create something that could create deepfakes. So it's not meant to give photorealistic results. Its focus is on creating beautiful images. I still managed to get, you know, quite photorealistic results. It's not impossible, but every image is basically pretty in the sense that it has good composition. The image is aesthetically very strong, unlike what DALL-E produces. And this was by design. That's how they designed it. So we can see here that the intent of the developers really shines through in the model. And it also feels like I have more control in Midjourney just because of the way the variations work. So all of these you're seeing started from the same seed phrase. And just by basically what I think of it like breeding, it's like evolution. For example, you see one that you like, you say, give me more like that one. It gives you a few more like that one. You pick one you like and you go through. Like, for example, maybe one at some point had a small, tiny bulb on its head. And I said, give me more like that one. And of those children, one had a slightly bigger bulb on its head. I said, give me more like that one. And after many, many iterations, you have things like this with a huge bulb on its head. So even though I've generated like thousands of these, it's not a case of I say, give me 1,000 images. It's like every iteration, there is intent. So yeah, just so many. For example, that group of 4 is the output of one iteration. And it's just mind-blowing how many of these things that you can create. It's quite incomprehensible. A key thing to understand here is I didn't imagine any of these creatures in my head as they are. Rather, this is all coming out of the computer's imagination, which is a kind of controversial way to put it, but I'm going to come to that. But I'm effectively steering that. The software is doing the imagining, and I'm doing the filtering. This is another direction another rabbit hole that I found in that part of the space. And this is a tiny sample. So this is what I'm working on right now. I'm pretty happy with these results. Again, it's the results of lots and lots of prompt tweaking and selective breeding. So really, the selective breeding seems to be, it's how we made wolves turn into poodles and chihuahuas. Well, it's evolution is how an amoeba turned into us. So it's a very similar way of working. And my aesthetic choices are the evolutionary selective pressure on what gets generated. So I want to wrap up with some final thoughts. Of course, there's lots of issues and questions around these technologies, where they're at and where they're going. I'm only going to mention a few of them very briefly because I want to focus on one particular topic. There are, of course, ethical and legal considerations and questions around what's happening. These models are trained on pretty much all of the images on the internet, including the works of artists that are alive without their consent. And what are the legal and ethical implications of using artists' work to train these models so that we can create images that resemble those artists' works without requiring their skill, their experience, and their labor, without the original artist being compensated or even acknowledged? And how do we, or do we even attempt to, manage consent of works being used for training such models? According to my research and understanding of copyright, which I'm not a legal scholar, but I've spoken to a lot of legal scholars about this, it appears that current copyright law allows for the scraping of data to be used in such models, but the outputs of such models cannot be copyrighted because it's been generated by a machine with apparently minimal human intervention. So how will copyright law evolve now that these technologies are becoming so powerful and ubiquitous? I think that's a very fascinating question. Okay, Since these models are trained on data on the internet, they encode within them all of our biases. So what are the downstream effects of this, and how can this be mitigated? Furthermore, the models also carry the biases of their developers. As you can see, Midjourney is radically different to DALL-E, and that's a conscious design decision by the developers of Midjourney. What will be the impact of these technologies on jobs? Jobs in the creative sectors: designers, illustrators, storyboard artists, 3D modelers, composers, video editors, script writers. Of course, there'll be loads of new jobs that are created, as always, but what happens to those who cannot adapt and their skills become obsolete? And these tools require immense computation and power to develop. So what are the consequences of this power being in the hands of so few and distributed to the masses only at their whim and under their control? So these are all difficult questions that we are going to have to answer and face. There are also some other interesting questions that are more philosophical in nature, but have very direct practical consequences. For example, one that I hear a lot: yeah, but is it art? If you type something into a computer and it gives you an image, is it art? Who's the artist? Is it me? Is it the machine? Is it the software developers? Is it the millions of people around the world that are alive, whose data the model was trained on? Now, I have some answers to these questions, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But I want to simplify this question by removing the amorphous term art and instead ask, who is the author? Because then we don't have to worry about, is it art? So who is the author? Is it me? Is it the machine? Is it the software developers? Is it the millions of people whose data the model was trained on? And I think this question has a simple answer. Yes, all of the above. Or maybe it's no, because I think the concept of authorship, as it has existed in the past, is becoming, if not already, is completely obsolete. Even the way that Midjourney works is very much geared towards emphasizing this. And as much as I hate the complete sensory overload load of Discord, I do love this aspect of Midjourney. This is Midjourney. If you're not familiar, it's basically a Discord bot. So it happens in a public chat. And if you haven't used Discord, imagine a WhatsApp group with 1 million people in it. And I'm not exaggerating, Midjourney has 1 million members. So in real time, you can see everybody typing their prompt in the public chats, and the results are automatically generated within a few seconds or minutes and posted back into the chats. Everybody can see, can learn from the prompts, can copy the prompts. You can take an image you like and just tweak the prompt and resubmit it. So the concept of ownership is blurred even further. And I like this about the way Midjourney is implemented, because it's acknowledging and making a feature of the fact that ownership is already so complicated, or authorship is so complicated within this system, and that the images that are created are the result of a distributed consciousness. But the problem is, in our society, we value heroes and heroines. That's what we want. And everything about the way our society is structured is around heroes and heroines, even everything we see in Hollywood. So I don't know how or even if our culture can shift to a different way of valuing collective creation. So that's a huge topic as well. I'm not going to go deeper into that. I want to go into the final question, which is actually not creativity. Creativity is a topic that we love to talk about, particularly with regards to machines being creative. In previous talks, I talk about this quote by Ada Lovelace that's always quoted, the idea that machines cannot be creative. I've written about this. Many people have written about this. I'll leave that for another time. I will just say that the system that is me plus the machine together is infinitely more creative, at least from a productivity point of view, than me without this machine. And the amount that I've been able to generate, not just images, but ideas in the past few months is quite ludicrous. So we can think, let's just call this AI-assisted creativity. And what's happening now and what we will see in the next few months and years, it is a paradigm shift. And I don't use that phrase lightly. I don't even know how to deal with it. So there should be no doubt that my creativity, including the system that includes the machine, is now on another plane, another dimension. But the key question, a word that I've used a few times throughout this presentation, is imagination. What's happening to imagination? And this is my final question that I'd like to leave you with. So first of all, I don't like the term AI because it has too much baggage. I know that when I say AI, each of you has something else going on in your head. I don't know what's going on in each of your head, but it's probably very different to what's actually happening in Midjourney or DALL-E. So I'm not going to say AI, I'm just going to talk about what's really happening. The software is learning, and many people will find that term too provocative as well to use in the context of a machine. But I like it, so I'm going to use it. So the software is learning, and it's learning from pretty much everything that's on the internet as curated by the developers. It's learning from the archive of almost the entirety of human knowledge that has been recorded on the internet, which is still ridiculously small compared to the entirety of human knowledge and the human experience, but it's still a heck of a lot. So when we interact with these models, we are somehow interacting with a model, an imperfect model, but a model nevertheless, of the entirety of recorded human knowledge online. All of these images that I've shown you today, I did not imagine in my head. I do feel authorship over them because I've spent many laborious hours, weeks, sometimes even months, steering and honing in particular outcomes. There was a creative process involved with intent. And so I feel I have a sense of authorship. And I did start with a vision in my head, but I did not start with these particular visions in my head. I just chose what I liked from the selection given to me by the software. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are many creative jobs today that work on that basis. But I just want to acknowledge that a generator is a very different skill set from a discriminator. I love Chopin, the composer, pianist. I know that I love Chopin. I can hear a Chopin nocturne, and even if I've never heard that particular piece before, I'll probably like it, and I might even recognize it to be Chopin. So I'm a very good musical discriminator. I know what I like. But being a composer is more than knowing what you like. Being a composer is typically, not always, but typically is about imagining a sequence of notes in your head and then bringing them into the world by writing them down. At least that's what being a composer used to be. So now there are people who can hear or see things entirely in their head that they want to bring into the world. This happens to me, so I know what it's like. And sometimes these people do have the skills to bring those things into the world, either themselves directly or by hiring other skilled people. And as such, they become artists or directors or composers. They imagine and they create. Sometimes there are people who also see or hear things entirely in their head, but unfortunately, they don't have the skills or opportunities to realize their visions, to bring their visions into the world. They become very frustrated. I know because that also happens to me sometimes. Now, these tools are going to be mind-blowingly liberating for both these types of people. But in reality, most of us, including myself again, we live somewhere in between these two extremes where we don't really have the full entirety of our vision clear in our head. Rather, it's a very iterative process. And back and forth, we generate something. And this is what's happening with these tools. But I wonder how much imagination are we externalizing? We'd already started offloading our memory and cognition to external devices tens of thousands of years ago. And first we started externalizing our memory, then we started externalizing actual cognitive processes. And all of this externalization came with benefits and disadvantages. For one thing, it's made this possible, that you can see and hear me being carried across on electrons and photons all around the world. It's allowed our technologies to develop in the way that it has developed. But on the flip side, there's evidence that our brains are being rewired to have shorter attention spans and poorer memory. I know from myself, when I was a teen, I used to be able to be someone who could finish a book in a few days and read 8 hours a day. Now I read 10 books at a time and I can't finish any. I can barely finish an article. So right now, when I use these tools, I am merging my imagination with the imagination of the collective consciousness, and I am being elevated to levels that I wasn't before. And I am, in effect, collaborating with every single person involved in the creation and output of this tool. And every iteration of this creative process, I evaluate the results of our collective imagination and the results of the fruits of our collective consciousness, our distributed collective consciousness. And this is amazing. And I have no doubt that this is taking me and all of humanity's creativity and imagination to other dimensions. But this is what's happening today. What about tomorrow? Today, I am merging my imagination, as I said, but what about in 10 years when these tools are infinitely better? Would I even need an imagination? Would we as a society even value human imagination? It seems like obviously we would, but history shows that all of these technologies rewire us in ways that is always unexpected. And I'm not asking about humanity on the whole, I'm asking about on an individual level. So my final slide, I know I overran a bit. I don't really know the answer to this. I'm just wondering, if you pardon the pun, I'm trying to imagine the outcome. In the same way that our brains are being rewired due to the externalization of memory and many other cognitive processes, what will be the long-term impact on our individual brains due to an externalization of imagination on this scale, as we gradually tend towards becoming discriminators instead of generators? In addition to what this technology enables, what does it disable? What is the Faustian bargain that we are signing here? /imagine prompt, a Faustian bargain, externalizing our imagination to computers trained on huge data sets, scraped from the internet. The imagination of the collective consciousness filtered through the machine is infinitely more vast than any single human could possibly comprehend. Very detailed, dramatic, epic, hyperreal, trending on ArtStation, 8K, Unreal Engine, --AR169. And that's what we get. But we also get this, so who knows? So I'm sorry I ran a bit over time. Thank you for your patience. And that's the end of my presentation.